Hello and welcome back to the Advanced Software Architecture course. My name is Riccardo Scandariato and this lecture is on domain modeling. This is part one. This lecture is structured in three parts. In part one, we will give a definition of what a domain model is, and we will position the use of the domain model in the context of the software process, in particular of requirements and software architecture. In the second part, in the next video, we will cover the elements that constitute a domain model, and in the last part, we will give you some tips and guidelines on how to build a domain model. Let's begin with a definition of what a domain model is, and this definition comes from Ivar Jakobsen. He's the guy behind the UML notation and the rational unified process. And according to his definition, a domain model represents the important concepts in the context of a business. And by concepts could be either things or events that happen in a business environment. For instance, if we consider a very simple, naive example of a car dealership, things in that business environment would be, for instance, representing the fact that there are cars, and events that happen in that business environment would be, for instance, the sale of a car. So in practice, a domain model is an object-oriented model. For instance, in UML, that would be a class diagram representing classes and associations. And typically, this model will contain concepts in the problem domain. What is very important to keep in mind is that these concepts belong to the real world, and they represent concepts, or which could be also physical things that the software has, or the software system has to deal with. In contrast to concepts that are only relevant to the internals of the application, so to the implementation of the system. So software-only concepts do not belong to the domain model. Let's have a look at one example to clarify this concept. A second distinction to keep in mind refers to domain models versus requirements specification. A domain model provides a structural view of the business environment. That means that the domain model is a static view containing objects of the business environment, and also events, and as well business rules that do not change over time. Those are the time invariants. To the best extent, you should try to avoid and fight the temptation of introducing functionality that is specific to the application or system that you have to build into the domain model. This functionality is better represented in the use cases of the application, and that is a way to represent the dynamic view of the system. And also, so this is the reason for this is related to the fact that the domain model should be, to the best extent, application independent, and should provide a representation of the business environment for all the applications that you might eventually build in that domain. The previous distinctions may become clearer when we look at the positioning of domain models in the software lifecycle. So as you know, we have two intertwined phases of analysis and design. And at this point, it should be clear that the architecture is the first step into the solution domain, where you start designing what your system is going to look like. The domain model instead is positioned within the analysis phase, where you are still trying to come up with the requirements for your system. In particular, a domain model contains two things, primarily and most importantly, the class diagram, the object model of the concepts in the business environment, which very often is supplemented with a glossary, which is a document, a piece of text, which details and describes some of the most complex concepts that you have in the class diagram. So it has a supporting role with respect to the main artifact, which is the class diagram. The domain model it's also so we also talked about the distinction between domain model and requirements, and this distinction is more apparent if we consider that the analysis phase can be seen as divided into a more application independent part and a more application specific part, meaning that the domain model is a representation of the important concepts in the business environment, and this representation tries to be independent vis-a-vis the specific application that you are building, while the details and the specifics of the application are represented in the functional and non-functional requirements, which are respectively captured by use cases and quality scenarios. Of course, these two parts of the analysis are strongly related, because the use cases and the quality scenarios do have to refer to the concepts that you had laid out in your object model of the domain. So the question might arise of why we are building a domain model. The most important role of a domain model is that of being a vocabulary that is shared among the stakeholders, and therefore providing a definition of the key concepts in the problem domain. In that sense, is a very valuable communication tool. So whenever two stakeholders are talking about, for instance, a sale, they know what they're referring to, because that concept is clearly defined in the domain model and possibly in the glossary as well. So in that sense, the domain model represents the slang or the lingo that is used within the software project. And as I already hinted to before, the domain model has also an important role in terms of reuse, because it's the foundation for defining the requirements. So the requirements refer to the terms and the concepts that are within the domain model. And if you are, for instance, building a family of products within the same in the same business domain, you can reuse the work that you have done in building the domain model, because those concepts will appear over and over, for instance, in your requirement specification for each of the products in the family. However, sometimes we don't have reuse in mind. For instance, we know from the beginning that we are going to build a one-off application, meaning a single application within a business environment, and not a family of products. Nevertheless, we might be interested in having a place where we can think about a new domain that we are working with, because we need to understand it better in order to get the requirements in a more precise way, and therefore building a better application at the end of the line. In this sense, when we build in a domain model in this context, the most important value of it is the focusing on the semantics and the understanding of the domain itself. And that is fine. We also, what happens typically in this case when we know that we don't have reuse in mind is that some application-specific concepts might creep into the domain model. And that is fine, of course, as long as we are aware that we are using the domain model in a way that is not the traditional way domain models are typically used. This is the end of part 1 of the lecture on domain modeling. Thanks for watching.